the idea that Gazans should make their own economy, yes, but surely if they want to leave Gaza, they should be entitled to do that as well. And when you made the point about Dublin, and if there was 13,000 rockets, of course we would be absolutely terrorised, and we want our government to act. But would we want them to act on the perpetrators, or would we want them to act on the innocent civilians that have zero to do with any of it?
I'll just give a very quick answer to that. When the people sending the rockets are sending it from inside private homes, and you want to act against the perpetrators, you have a choice. Either you don't react, or you knock out the rocket launchers wherever they are. Look, loss of life is always loss of life, and it doesn't matter where it is in the world, and it is always regrettable. But it is also part of what conflict, it's the byproduct of conflict. If I could wave a magic wand, I would say no more loss of life. Let's argue, let's debate, let's have negotiations, let's get serious about the negotiations, but let's stop the threat to livelihood, and then both sides could start moving back from the brink. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening, and that would really be the game changer.
I might just come back to you, Rachel, and then I'm going to go to the audience.
Well, while I was there, we also visited Esterat, and one of the main things that I found there, and with civil society groups that were working, just living in Esterat, and yes, they are living in constant terror. It was awful, they suffer from post-traumatic stress. They're constantly stressed. It's terrible for the lives of the children there, terrible for the whole communities. But what I really found amazing was the human issue, and that's what really came out there, and what a lot of organisations in Israel and in Palestine are trying to achieve. That you're not looking at it as an Arab issue or a Muslim issue or a Jewish issue. It's a human issue, and it's about human rights. And what she was saying, this woman from Esterat, was that she tries to, in any way that she could, to try and engage with communities in Gaza, because she's like that they are the same as us, and they are the same. And she said, from what she does, then she's completely isolated by her government, ostracised by political parties, ostracised by communities for wanting to take this approach and saying that we don't want these, conflict to go on, and really trying to engage with human communities in Gaza. And what I would say, it's the same if you're looking in the West Bank, because what I saw really on a daily basis was sort of a systematic humiliation of a society, really particularly of children, and how children are growing up in an environment that is so violent and so aggressive and so oppressive that it is going to lead to radicalisation. And I think it's the same in Gaza, and it's the same in the West Bank. When you have these communities that children are growing up with this on a daily basis, that they can't access health, they can't access education. Everything is a struggle, even trying to work, even access to water, something that you and I would take for granted on a daily basis. So if you're growing up in this sort of environment, then how are you going to feel when you're growing up? I mean, it does lead to radicalisation. And I know there is a huge movement now of younger generation in Palestine operating on non-violent resistance, but even that is being oppressed. And I think that's something we really have to look at in terms of the peace talks also.
Joanna, you want to come in there?
Well, the former president, Sharon, died there recently, and he got it. I suppose articles that were written about him at the time, he was praised about how when he had withdrawn from Gaza. But I actually think that was a mistake. I think that I don't think Israel was right to make a unilateral move at the time. I think it should have been a negotiated withdrawal. And people might think that's funny, but I think what they did was then they left this huge vacuum that paved the way for Hamas. And I don't agree with the blockade. I think that something needs to be done about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But I don't really know how we would go about achieving that except by negotiation and...
So a negotiation with Hamas, they're the government of Gaza.
Well, that's the problem. I suppose I'd be interested in... Because I have to say now, I'm not so familiar, I suppose, with the issue. I don't know all the nitty-gritty, and I don't know as much as Rachel or Caoimhe or Yanky. I'm much more, I suppose, looking at it from the outside. But I would feel you should negotiate with anyone. I think that's what peace processes involve, and I just would be interested to hear your views about what do you think? Do you think it's possible
Yanky, do you think it's possible for Gaza to be, or sorry, Hamas to be brought to the table? I mean, you know, eventually they will, if they're brought to the table, like this issue of them saying that they won't admit that Israel has the right to exist. That is a part of negotiation as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if I can quote the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he says, you make peace with enemies, you don't make peace with friends. And so, yes, I think that Hamas can, and I imagine will be. But can I just make a quick comment about the withdrawal? I actually don't agree with Joanna on this one. At the time when Israel withdrew from Gaza, I think it was a very brave step. Now, today, looking back, in the light of what happened as a result of the withdrawal, we can easily say it was a mistake. But at the time, it looked like a very bold step. One of the things that happened after the withdrawal is that Israel left acres of hothouses for flowers and other things, didn't dismantle them, didn't destroy them, left them pristine condition, hoping, or rather assuming, that Hamas would then bring in workers and start a flower industry, or whatever it was. It might not have been flowers, it could have been vegetables. And instead what happened was, almost immediately, or almost as soon as Israel departed, they came and destroyed it, and therefore, coming back to the business side, destroyed the possibility of creating jobs. This is wanton destruction, and this is not in the interests of anybody. It didn't hurt Israel because they'd gone. It only hurt the Palestinians in Gaza, and I just felt this was a real crime to do that when it was there for them. So we have a problem here with who are you talking to? But in answer to that first question, yes, Hamas will. Don't forget there have been negotiations with Hamas, prisoner swaps, etc. There's already been negotiations with Hamas, and no one can say there haven't been. They will eventually come in, I think, to the peace process.
Okay, I might just put it out to people out there. If you just want to keep it brief, your question or your point.
No, just on the very last point about wanton destruction in Gaza, and I just say to people here, if you haven't read the Goldstone report about what happened during Caoimhe, if you talk about wanton destruction, when factories, every bit of infrastructure was destroyed, industrial destruction in Gaza was actually destroyed, schools, hospitals were destroyed by Caoimhe. I mean, greenhouses, fair enough if they were destroyed, but I mean, when you talk about wanton destruction, I mean, there's no comparison whatsoever. I mean, I think that's, now, just a couple of things I'd like to come back on, if you don't mind. I've just introduced myself. My name is Martin Quigley. I'm the chairperson of the Irish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And just a couple of things that have been said here. Just to go back to, we're talking about the barrier, the wall. The wall is illegal. It's been found to be illegal by the International Court of Justice in 2004. The settlements that the wall is protecting, that will become part of, the Yanky says will become part of Israel, are illegal as well. So that's the point we have to start talking about. These are actually illegal. Gaza is under siege. It's as if, when you talk about Gaza, it's as if when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they went to the walls, they completely surrounded, they completely control Gaza by land, sea and air. Gaza is not free. The West Bank is like a prison as well, because it's controlled by the Israeli checkpoint on the Jordan border. So Palestinians are actually imprisoned. As I know, this conversation is about the peace talks, in a sense. I think that was the title of the program. While since even Oslo was started, 5 years after Oslo, the number of settlements actually doubled. So peace talks are really a sham, and peace talks will keep going on, and Israel will keep taking land. And someone, I think it was Mustafa Barghouti, said, it's as if you're arguing with someone about pizza and who has the right, but someone is eating at the same time. So Palestine is disappearing. Palestinians in the West Bank, which is 22% of historic Palestine, just occupied, have access to 40% because of settler roads, settlements in the West Bank. So that's the position of Palestinians. So Joanna Tuffy said, well, there's two sides. it's two sides. One with the fourth most powerful army in the world. So like that's the imbalance of power. And there's no one there on the Palestinian side to try and balance it up. The only thing that will bring a real peace in Palestine is what happened with South Africa, which is boycott, divestment, sanctions, which will move Israel to actually finding that peace with Palestinians.
Okay.
Dermot Bellidi is my name. I'm information officer at the Embassy of Israel in Dublin. He talks about Israel imposing controls over all the borders of Gaza immediately after the withdrawal. Let me put that in context. For 4 years before the withdrawal, rocket fire had been coming into Israel at the rate of an average of roughly 10 attacks per week. That's including rocket fire and mortar fire, roughly 10 per week. In the immediate months after the withdrawal, rocket fire and mortar fire increased immediately to 3 times that amount, 36 attacks per week. So we're talking about a trebling of the rate before making the controls around the border necessary. When Israel had withdrawn its troops and dragged 9,000 Jewish settlers out of their homes, it expected a peace dividend for that. In most cultures, when you make a relatively small gesture in the direction of what your opponents are demanding from you, that's taken as a gesture of goodwill. It's taken as an indicator of a desire to settle the conflict. In other words, it's taken as a down payment. This is what most Israeli opinion thought the Gaza withdrawal would bring about, that it would be seen by the other side as an earnest of good intentions, and that they would then be able to follow it up with more land concessions in the West Bank. Instead of that, the exact opposite happened. Rocket and mortar fire trebled. It then doubled again after 2007. In the 1 year between mid-2007 and mid-2008, it doubled again. So by the middle of 2008, it was actually running at 6 times the rate that it had before Israel. But that is the context for all this talk about the siege and the controls of the borders and so on. These things don't happen by accident. They happen in a context. And if people want to understand why Hamas are doing this and why they trebled and then doubled again their rocket fire, you need to just do one simple thing. Get on the internet, Google the Hamas Covenant of 1988. Because if you want to understand why people are doing something, go and find out what they say is the reason why they're doing it. The Hamas Covenant tells you all. It tells you all you need to know about the motivation behind the rocket attacks. And among them, the very first article tells you that no land in the Middle East that has once been ruled by Islam can ever be surrendered until the day of resurrection. Those are the words.
Well, I suppose that's the whole point of negotiating with Hamas. Did anyone else have another
they
point?
say that you cannot negotiate.
Well, we just discussed that.
With regards to the wall, barrier, whatever you want to call it, you said that there were gaps in the barrier, and you don't think that therefore this barrier wall is the cause of what stopped the suicide attacks that were happening. So I was just wondering if you can offer an alternative explanation of how these suicide attacks have stopped, and maybe from your experience having lived in the area for 3 months, what steps you see the Palestinian Authority or Hamas taking to minimise the violence on the Palestinian side.
Okay. A huge number of the suicide bombing attacks were taking place during the Intifada. The Intifada ended, so that is one of the reasons. Another reason would be increased Israeli security, but not necessarily the wall, and increased Israeli intelligence. And the other reason was that during times of that Hamas would have sort of non-official ceasefires. So there's some of the reasons. I didn't spend any time in Gaza, so I can't really discuss that in detail. On the ground, though, what I would find on a daily basis was that the Palestinians that I worked with, usually a lot of them in rural communities and in the city of Bethlehem, are just struggling to survive. All they want is peace. They want to be able to work. They want to develop an economy. They want the right to education, they want the right to healthcare, like anybody would want. I did not meet any single person in my whole time travelling out throughout the West Bank that was radical in terms of purporting violence against Israel. All they really are looking for is a just peace and an end to the occupation, because the occupation stifles the whole community, the whole livelihood of the West Bank. So in terms of people, other ways of the Palestinian Authority, I didn't have any engagement with the Palestinian Authority of how they're trying to prevent attacks, but I think certainly from the West Bank side, there were no attacks on Israel during the time that I was there, nor many that I've heard of since.
So you don't have any information on what the actual official bodies are doing?
The official bodies in terms of the Palestinian Authority?
Or Hamas?
In terms of Hamas, no, I didn't spend any time in Gaza.
I think there had been some commentary from Hamas after the second Intifada that they decided that they would just not use suicide bombing as a tactic. I think that was some commentary that came from Hamas in the emerging aftermath of that. So that's what they say anyway. But I think we should move on to a couple of other issues. And one of the most talked about issue of the last few days was the Scarlett Johansson deciding to stick with SodaStream in the West Bank rather than and resign from her post as an activist for Oxfam. And I think the issue of boycotting is prominent. Obviously, we had the death of Nelson Mandela the last few months, and we remember the boycott against South Africa, which people say was very prominent in removing apartheid. And Trócaire supports, and it's very important to distinguish, a boycott of the settlement areas. So goods coming out of the settlement areas should not be purchased or imported into Ireland. That's something that the Irish state supports and that Trócaire states. It's not a boycott of Israel. But how do you think this, I mean, the settlement goods, as far as I know, it's worth about 100 million euros to the Israeli government per year. So it's not a huge amount in terms of the Israeli GDP, but it's more about, I suppose, you know, the political impact. Why does Trócaire support this?
Well, Trócaire, and thanks for making the distinction, because it's not about boycotting Israel and Israeli goods, it is about the settlement produce. And the reason for that is that goods that are produced on occupied land, where the occupation itself is illegal, under international law, the companies that produce those goods and that investors, if you like, investing in the companies that produce those goods, they're potentially liable under international law. And I think highlighting this issue brings home to people the fact that the occupation is illegal. And the fact that the occupation is going on for such a long time means that this has gradually over the years, I guess, been pushed off the agenda a little bit, but it brings back the whole notion of international humanitarian and human rights law needing to be at the centre of the discussions. So unless a just peace can only be achieved if there's a recognition of the atrocities and violations on both sides, and if it's based on the principles of international human rights law. That is our belief. So we think that the settlements issue is it's a serious issue in its own right, in terms of the people who have been dispossessed of their land, in terms of the water usage issues that arise. So the bulk of the Palestinians in the West Bank have very little access to water. Water is disproportionately available to the settler communities there. Perhaps Rachel could talk a bit more about that than I could. But I think highlighting this issue makes it clear to companies that invest in settlement products that actually they're running a risk. And the risk is not just to their reputation, actually there are risks of lawsuits. And that makes it clear that this is a serious issue around violations of international human rights law.
Joanna, you're a member of the Labour Party. Eamon Gilmore, Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs, very much supports the boycotting of settlements among the Council of Foreign Ministers in the EU. And just during the Irish presidency, Mary Robinson, our former president, and former President Jimmy Carter and Eamon Gilmore announced support for the boycott from goods from settlement areas.
Well, I mean, I personally, I'm opposed to boycotts. I think the position of Eamon Gilmore and others is a bit more nuanced than that. I don't think they're suggesting that things should be boycotted, but rather that people it should be labelled and people can make their own decision. The debate on this has shifted in recent years, because it used to be just a straightforward call for a boycott of Israeli goods and services and so on. I can see that this is a different argument, but I still am against boycotts in principle, because you can come at this from different angles, because I don't know if he still has the same position, but at one stage Noam Chomsky was against boycotts, even though he would be very, very much on, very critical of Israel. He didn't agree with boycotts as a tactic. And when we had this issue raised at our own party conference a few years ago, Michael D. Higgins was our spokesperson for Foreign Affairs. There was a motion put calling for the Labour Party to adopt a policy of boycotts. And in fact, Michael D. Higgins and Princess Rossa both spoke against the motion. Now, at the same time, there was a very critical motion of Israel adopted at the same conference, but the motion for boycotts was actually referred back to our executive, which is very often that's the answer when, I suppose, rather than defeating a motion, but that's very often the way the Labour Party deals with certain controversial issues. But the fact is we didn't adopt a policy of boycott at the time. And you see that Michael D. Higgins would have argued at the time was, as a tactic, he didn't agree with it. Now, I would have got up and spoke against that motion at the time. I'm opposed in principle to boycotts in this situation. I don't agree that it's the same. And I actually went as a young student in Trinity and stood outside Dunnes Stores, when there was pickets at the time about, the sacking of the Dunnes Stores workers and so on. So I obviously at the time I did support the boycott in relation to South African goods, but I don't see it as the same at all. And in this case there is a conflict here, and there are people with diverse views in both countries.
So would you say that it's not an occupied area, that it's disputed territory rather than occupied?
Yes, it is, and there's
despite the fact that international law would say that the boundaries of Israel are here and the moving in settlement is actually disputed. So you dispute international law in that regard?
Well, I don't think it's international law to have a boycott, and in the north of Ireland, I know where I stood in relation to the Northern Ireland conflict, but I still felt there was two sides, and that the matter had to be negotiated. And to bring boycotts into a conflict is to take a hostile act against one side in a conflict. Yes, one side, there may be an imbalance of power. Yes, there may be disproportionate tactics. Yes, there may be wrong actions on one side that is stronger and all of that. But it is a conflict, and what I want to see is
people not all those things that you listed there, disproportionate use, occupation, all those things, they're okay because it's a conflict, or they're okay?
No, they're not okay.
So I suppose that the international community should not react to any of those things as they see fit.
No, well, I think they should react, but I just don't agree with the boycott.
So reacting using a different tactic.
Well, I think in our case in Ireland, we're not going to go in and take anything. Our only action really will be that we will use diplomatic pressure. That is our tactic.
Labelling is a form of diplomatic pressure, I suppose, because it's saying Israel needs to label that these goods are coming from settlement areas rather than Israel, so people can make up their own decision. And is that something you'd support?
Well, no, I have no problem with people making their own decision and being informed in their decision. But my issue is that if you have boycott campaigns, I don't agree with it in relation to the conflict situation. I don't think it's the answer. But the other side of it is that when you have boycotts, what happens is that people that don't agree with the boycott get targeted, and I have been at the other end of that. I spoke at a meeting organised with the Israeli embassy a few years ago. Now, possibly, in retrospect, I regretted agreeing to the meeting, going to speak at the meeting, because I think I hadn't really thought about the topic and how it might be perceived in terms of my speaking at it. So I actually think I made a mistake, but once I had agreed, there was no way I was going to pull out, because I could see then that I would have compounded it wrong in the first place, if you can understand. But the thing is, I was at the other end of a campaign by the Irish Palestine Solidarity at the time to pull out. And so was other speakers at the event, people who are not politicians. And I found it wasn't that I was threatened or anything like that, but the intensity of it was unbelievably stressful. Okay, and like when you get into boycotts, you get into that. People facing that.
So do you think that's just like Scarlett Johansson, who, even though she is an ambassador for Oxfam, so she did put herself in that position where she defended human rights, and Oxfam have a specific position on the settlement areas. Do you think that sort of pressure on people like her, similar to you, she was just engaging with SodaStream, and therefore she was entitled to sign a contract and earn a livelihood?
Yeah, I suppose I don't know enough about it.
Okay.
I'll
just move on to Rachel, actually. Rachel, hundreds of Palestinians work in the West Bank for Israeli companies like SodaStream, and if they didn't have those jobs, they'd have no livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, well, that is one point. Realistically, what you would want in terms of a just peace is that the Palestinians are given access to their own land and they can develop their own economy, build their own industries. The expansion of settlements is completely hindering that. The more the settlements expand, there is no possibility for a development of a Palestinian economy. They are forced to work in the settlements because they have no other option. People have to feed their families, people have to survive. The reason I think that the boycott movement is taking off so much is because people have come to realise that negotiations have failed over the last 20 years, and it's sort of more of a grassroots movement or a non-violent resistance movement that is seeing that things like boycotts, because it did work in South Africa, is the only way that maybe the international community and people at a grassroots level or even at a sort of civil society level and leading up then to a diplomatic level can actually put pressure on Israel to abide by international law and to stop settlement construction, which, as we know, is completely illegal under international law.
So, Yanky, John Kerry said that Israel is going to find itself further isolated if there is no progress on the peace talks, and there have been some very high level of boycotting from certain countries as well as certain intellectual people on Israel. It's definitely true that the boycott movement is growing larger.
Let me first, if I may, make a quick comment about an earlier point that was raised. Anyone who knows Israel, anyone who's been to Israel, anyone who knows anything about Israel knows that to talk about Israel as an apartheid state is so obscene and so absolutely wrong that one almost doesn't know where to start. The comparisons just do not stand up. It is not an apartheid state. We have an Arab judge sent the former president of Israel to jail for rape. That doesn't sound to me like apartheid. We've got Arabs in the diplomatic service, Arabs in the sort of at every level of society. To talk about apartheid, and we all know what apartheid looked like, is absolutely wrong and obscene. There's a level of assumption here, of the panel and some of the speakers, that it is internationally agreed that the settlements, that the borders, that building and building factories on the West Bank and all sorts of other things, and the barrier are regarded internationally as illegal. Well, it's actually not true. It is disputed. There are legal arguments on both sides, and it is by no means certain that what everyone thinks is certain is so, because the actual legalities go back to the San Remo conference in the 1920s, which set the scene for everything that came after that, and nothing has actually changed that. But again, we could spend all evening talking about what is the definition of legal or illegal. And I want to come back to the theme of this evening. That John Kerry is now exerting bullying tactics on Israel and making all sorts of threats says to me that he's not a very smart man, because he absolutely doesn't know who he's dealing with. But that's, again, that would be a political comment. The only way forward is for Israel and the Palestinians to continue negotiating in good faith. Now, there hasn't been much good faith. There really hasn't. And that's what the international community should be doing. They should be encouraging both sides to move closer in negotiations rather than blaming and blaming and blaming. That is not going to lead anywhere.
On the issue of settlements and whether or not they're illegal or not, and I think they broadly use the Hague Convention definition of occupation, and the Red Cross work within there under the 4th Geneva Convention, which deals with occupation. So there is, I know that there are arguments on both sides, but there is a strong argument to say that it is occupied. But let's just say it's disputed territory. There are many people who have Ottoman Empire deeds to land in the West Bank, which is not viable under Israeli courts, and there are many farmers, therefore, people who have their land taken off them for this reason. Homes are demolished to make other settlement areas. What do you say to that?
I say that there are realities when there is a conflict, and we've seen that in the last 100 years, the way Europe was totally reconstituted as a result of the war. I've got property somewhere in Poland, and I can't get to that either. There are, no, seriously, there are 800,000 and 850,000 Jews who left Arab countries, were kicked out of Arab countries immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel. They've got their keys as well. This is not about what belonged to whom once. It's about today. And today, just a minute, today there are two authorities that can have a mandate to negotiate, and it's going to be a political negotiation. It's not going to be about legalities. It's going to be what is the shape of a peace understanding between two independent states. That's what everybody wants.